This war was lost before it even began.
This war was lost before it even began. Before the first arrow was fired, this war was already over. Not because the enemy was stronger, but because an empire believed it could never fall. For 1,000 years, Byzantine survived everything. So when warning signs appeared, no one panicked. Problems were managed, reforms were delayed. Comfort felt safer than change. By 1071, the army still marched, the banners still flew, the empire still looked powerful. But trust was gone, loyalty was fractured, and the real collapse had already begun, quietly. The Battle of Manzikert would be blamed, but battles don't end empires. Denial does. This is not the story of a lost fight. It's the story of how wars are lost before they even begin. The Battle of Manzikert, 1071, and the collapse that started in silence. History often remembers wars by their battles, the clash of armies, the noise of steel, the moment one side breaks and the other claims victory. But some wars are already lost long before the first arrow was fired. In the year 1071, the Byzantine Empire marched east to confront a rising power, the Seljuk Turks. On paper, the Byzantines should have won. They had numbers, resources, prestige, and 1,000 years of imperial tradition behind them. Yet what followed was not merely a defeat. It was the beginning of an irreversible collapse, and the reason had little to do with the enemy. An empire that believed in its own permanence. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had survived everything history could throw at it. Barbarian invasions, plagues, religious conflict, civil wars. From Constantinople, the empire appeared eternal. Its administrators believed that borders might shift, but the system itself would endure. The army still existed, the treasury still collected taxes, the emperor still ruled by divine right. That belief that permanence was guaranteed became the empire's greatest weakness. By the mid-11th century, the Byzantine military was no longer what it once had been. Native soldiers were replaced with mercenaries. Command positions were filled not by experience, but by political loyalty. Court intrigue mattered more than frontier defense. Still, no one panicked. Why would they? The empire had always survived. A threat that didn't look like one. The Seljuk Turks were expanding into Anatolia, raiding Byzantine lands. But to the imperial court, this was not an existential crisis. It was a management problem. Rather than reform the army, strengthen logistics, and unify command, the empire chose the easier option, temporary solutions. Mercenaries were hired instead of trained. Rival generals were tolerated instead of removed. Political enemies were brought into the campaign instead of neutralized. The emperor Romanos IV Diogenes marched east with an army that looked powerful but was deeply divided. That division would decide the war before it began. An army without trust. At Manzikert, the Byzantine army was not a single force. It was a coalition of factions who distrusted one another more than they feared the enemy. Some generals resented the emperor. Others hoped for his failure. One faction actively planned betrayal. When battle came, orders were unclear. Signals were misinterpreted. Units hesitated, not because they were weak, but because they did not trust who stood beside them. Then came the moment that sealed everything. A key commander, Andronikos Doukas, deliberately withdrew his forces from the battlefield, spreading the rumor that the emperor had been killed. Panic followed, not because the Byzantines were outmatched, but because the army no longer believed in itself. The Seljuks exploited the confusion. The emperor was captured. The battle was lost. But the empire's fate had already been decided long before that day. Why the defeat could not be reversed. Empires can survive military losses. What they cannot survive is internal decay. After Manzikert, Byzantium did not immediately fall, but it lost something far more important than territory. It lost control. Civil wars erupted. Commanders acted independently. Provinces stopped trusting the capital. The empire tried to recover, but every solution came too late. Authority once surrendered does not return easily. Trust once broken does not repair itself. Within a generation, Anatolia, the empire's heartland, was gone. Historians often point to Manzikert as a turning point, but the truth is simpler and more unsettling. The war was lost before it even began. The real lesson history leaves behind. The Byzantine defeat was not caused by military inferiority. It was caused by believing stability meant permanence, choosing political comfort over reform, allowing loyalty to become conditional, mistaking short-term efficiency for long-term control. These are not ancient problems, they are timeless. History's most dangerous moments are not loud. They are quiet decisions made in confidence, decisions that feel reasonable at the time. And by the time consequences appear, the outcome is already inevitable. Final thought. The Battle of Manzikert teaches us something uncomfortable. Collapse rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as normalcy. Most wars are decided not on the battlefield, but in the years when leaders choose not to act. Because when trust is gone, authority fragmented, and reform delayed, the war is already over. What followed was not defeat, it was disintegration. After Manzikert, the Byzantine Empire did not collapse overnight. That illusion is comforting but false. Empires rarely fall in a single moment. They unravel. At first, officials in Constantinople treated the loss as manageable. The emperor was eventually released. Treaties were signed. Borders were redrawn on parchment. The court convinced itself that order could be restored with negotiation and ceremony. But something fundamental had shifted. The army no longer obeyed the throne unquestioningly. Provincial governors began acting like independent rulers. Generals fought each other instead of securing frontiers. The imperial center still spoke with authority, but fewer people listened. The empire still looked powerful. It was already hollow. Anatolia, the loss that could not be replaced. Anatolia was not just territory. It was manpower, food, recruitment, and identity. For centuries, it had supplied the soldiers who defended the empire and the grain that fed its cities. After Manzikert, Seljuk forces moved steadily into the region, not through dramatic conquest, but through settlement. Villages changed hands quietly, tax systems collapsed, imperial roads went unmaintained. The empire attempted counteroffensives, but without unity, each campaign weakened it further. Mercenaries demanded higher pay. Local populations no longer trusted imperial protection. Loyalty became transactional. Once Anatolia slipped away, Byzantium lost the ability to regenerate itself. From that moment on, survival became reaction, not strategy. The empire that chose delay over reform. Reform was possible, painful, disruptive, but possible. The army could have been rebuilt, corrupt officials removed, power re-centralized. Instead, the court chose delay. Each faction feared reform would weaken its own position. Each compromise preserved the present at the cost of the future. Leaders convinced themselves that the crisis would stabilize on its own, as crises sometimes do. This one didn't. Every year of inaction made the next reform harder. Every postponed decision narrowed the remaining options. By the time serious reforms were attempted, the empire no longer had the strength to enforce them. Why the Seljuks were not the real enemy. It is tempting to blame the Seljuks. They were visible, foreign, convenient. But the Seljuks did not destroy Byzantium. They stepped into space Byzantium abandoned. The real enemy was fragmentation, political, military, psychological. When an empire begins negotiating with itself instead of commanding itself, it signals weakness. When loyalty becomes conditional, authority becomes temporary. The Seljuks simply recognized what Byzantium refused to admit. The center no longer controlled the edges. The long shadow of a quiet decision. Decades later, Byzantium would call for help from the West. That call would trigger the Crusades. Ironically, the Crusades, intended as salvation, would further destabilize the empire. Foreign armies marched through imperial lands, alliances turned into occupations, trust eroded further. In 1204, Constantinople itself would be sacked, not by ancient enemies, but by supposed allies. That catastrophe traces its roots back to 1071, not because of one lost battle, but because of a mindset. History's most dangerous illusion. The Byzantines believed that because their empire had always survived, it always would. That belief delayed action. That delay surrendered control. That surrender made collapse inevitable. History does not punish weakness immediately. It punishes denial, slowly, patiently, without warning. By the time consequences become visible, the outcome is already locked in. Why this story still matters. This is why the story of Manzikert is not medieval trivia. It is a pattern. Organizations, states, institutions, even civilizations fail the same way. They mistake endurance for immunity. They confuse stability with strength. They prioritize comfort over correction. They delay until delay becomes destiny. The most decisive moments are rarely dramatic. They are administrative, political, quiet. They happen when leaders choose not to act. The final truth history leaves us. Byzantium did not fall because it lost a war. It fell because it stopped believing that it could lose. And that is why this war was lost before it even began. Final chapter. The silence after the fall. In the end, there was no final battlefield worthy of legend, no single moment when the world stopped. The Byzantine Empire continued, on maps, in titles, in ceremony. Emperors still wore crowns, coins were still minted, prayers were still spoken in marble halls. But the empire no longer decided its own future. By the time enemies stood at the gates centuries later, the outcome no longer mattered. The decisions that sealed Byzantium's fate had already been made, quietly, long before swords were raised. This is how wars are truly lost. Not by defeat, but by delay. Not by enemies, but by comfort. Not by invasion, but by the belief that invasion could never happen. The Byzantines did not fail to fight, they failed to change, and history is merciless to those who confuse survival with strength. The warning history never stops repeating. Every age believes it is different. Every power believes it is stable. Every system believes it has time. History disagrees. The most dangerous words ever spoken by any empire are not threats, but reassurances. We still have control. This is temporary. We can fix it later. Later rarely comes. This is why this story refuses to stay in the past. This is not just a medieval tragedy. It is a mirror. Empires fall. Institutions decay. Systems collapse. Not when they are challenged, but when they stop responding to challenge. The war that destroys them is not the one they lose on the battlefield, but the one they refuse to acknowledge. History's final verdict. Byzantium did not lose because it was weak. It lost because it believed weakness was impossible. And that is why, long before the first arrow flew, long before the first city fell, this war was lost before it even began.